The overhead bin clanged shut, rattling the worn plastic, and a flight attendant, her smile tight and practiced, barely glanced at the boy in seat 14A. He sat, utterly still, his eyes fixed on the airplane window, seemingly oblivious to the bustling chaos of passengers squeezing past, their carry-on luggage bumping against his armrest. A woman with a toddler clutched to her hip jostled him, muttering a quick, dismissive, "Excuse me," without waiting for a reply, her gaze already drifting towards her own seat. The air hummed with the low thrum of the engines, a sound that seemed to vibrate only within his own skull, a private symphony no one else could hear or appreciate. He felt the dismissive glances, the subtle shifts in posture, as people tried to create more distance, as if his quiet presence was an inconvenience, a strange, unidentifiable stain on the fabric of their routine journey. The world moved around him, a blur of indifference, and he, Leo, was merely a silent, unnoticed passenger, a ghost among the living, his brilliant mind already miles above the clouds, dissecting the complex mechanisms of flight. A faint, sickly sweet scent of stale peanuts and disinfectant filled the cabin, a scent that prickled at Leo's nose, far too intense for his heightened senses. He adjusted the collar of his faded blue hoodie, pulling it tighter around his neck, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of self-comfort. The flight attendant's voice, a saccharine drone over the intercom, announced the final boarding call, her words a garbled wave of noise that crashed against his eardrums. He could feel the vibrations of footsteps echoing through the floor, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to mimic the frantic beat of his own heart, a heart that yearned for understanding, for connection, but found only the cold, unyielding wall of indifference. The woman with the toddler now spoke loudly into her phone, her conversation a jarring intrusion into his carefully constructed inner peace, her laughter echoing off the hard surfaces of the cabin, sharp and unwelcomed. Leo retreated further into himself, a fortress built of silence and intricate thoughts, his mind already miles away, lost in the intricate dance of aerodynamics and thrust, a world where he was not a burden, but a master. The seatbelt sign flickered on, an abrupt, bright orange slash against the soft amber of the cabin lights. A gruff voice from behind him, belonging to a man in a rumpled suit, complained loudly about the limited legroom, his words laced with irritation, seemingly directed at the universe but landing squarely on Leo's acute hearing. Leo's hand twitched, a barely contained urge to cover his ears, to block out the cacophony of human discontent. He focused instead on the small scratched window beside him, imagining the intricate patterns of air currents outside, the invisible forces that lifted this enormous metal bird into the sky. The weight of invisible judgments pressed down on him, a heavy blanket of unspoken assumptions about his capabilities, his worth. He was just a boy, quiet and odd, easily dismissed, a space filler in an airplane seat, nothing more. The engines whined, a rising crescendo, signaling the imminent pushback from the gate, and with it, the undeniable feeling of being trapped, suspended in a world that neither saw nor valued his true essence. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, a disembodied presence offering perfunctory greetings in the standard flight time. Leo's head tilted almost imperceptibly, his focus sharpening. While others heard a routine announcement, he dissected the subtle inflections, the barely perceptible tremor in the pilot's tone, a tiny ripple in the placid surface of normalcy that only he seemed to detect. His fingers, long and slender, traced the faint lines of a diagram he'd secretly drawn on the back of his boarding pass, a complex schematic of an aircraft engine, its components meticulously labeled with tiny, precise handwriting. The passenger across the aisle yawned widely, oblivious, already reaching for a magazine. No one noticed Leo's intense concentration, the way his brow furrowed slightly as he mentally cross-referenced the pilot's words with his vast, internal database of aviation knowledge. He was a universe of information, contained within a quiet, unassuming shell, utterly invisible to the casual observer. A flight attendant, younger than the first, walked slowly down the aisle, her gaze sweeping over the passengers, a silent appraisal. When her eyes lingered on Leo, a flicker of something unreadable, pity, annoyance, crossed her face before she moved on, her expression smoothly resetting to professional neutrality. Leo felt the subtle shift in air pressure as the cabin door hissed shut, sealing them inside this metallic tube. The confined space, usually a source of anxiety for others, was for him a contained environment, predictable in its dimensions, a structure whose every component he instinctively understood. He wasn't afraid of the plane. He understood its bones, its muscles, its very breath. What he felt was the familiar heavy cloak of expectation, the unspoken assumption that he was fragile, incapable, an object of mild curiosity at best, a silent, static presence simply existing in the margins of other people's busy lives, his true depth utterly unplumbed, his extraordinary mind completely ignored. The final safety demonstration began, the flight attendants moving with practiced robotic precision, pointing to emergency exits and demonstrating the oxygen masks. Leo watched, not with casual disinterest but with an analyst's eye, cross-referencing their movements with the exact specifications detailed in the aircraft's operational manual, a document he had committed to memory years ago. He noticed a slight hesitation in the way one attendant buckled a demonstration seatbelt, a micro pause that suggested a moment of distraction or perhaps a latent insecurity. No one else would have registered it. No one else would have cared. But for Leo, every detail was a piece of a larger puzzle, a constant stream of data his brain processed with relentless efficiency. He sat there, a silent sentinel, observing, absorbing, and calculating, while the world around him, loud and oblivious, continued to underestimate the dormant volcano of genius simmering just beneath his calm, composed exterior. Leo, 17 years old, sat with a quiet intensity that often made adults uncomfortable, mistaking his stillness for disinterest or defiance. His hair, a rich, dark brown, fell slightly over his forehead, almost touching the wire frames of his glasses, which were perpetually perched a little too low on his nose. His clothes, a faded blue hoodie and worn jeans, seemed almost to melt into the drab airplane seat, as if he sought to become as unremarkable as possible. He rarely met anyone's gaze directly, his eyes the color of deep moss, usually fixed on a distant point or lost in the intricate patterns of the window pane. His posture was rigid, almost stiff, a testament to his effort to control his body, to keep the sensory input from overwhelming him, a constant internal battle that few recognized or understood. His hands, though, were a different story. Long, slender fingers that often twitched or tapped a silent rhythm against his thigh, a restless energy that betrayed the calm facade. His mind, however, was a galaxy of constellations, each star a piece of information, a fact about the world, meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced. He could tell you the precise model of the aircraft, its manufacturing year, and the average lifespan of its hydraulic pumps without a moment's hesitation. He often replayed conversations in his head, not for emotional content, but for the patterns of speech, the subtle shifts in tone, the logical progression, or lack thereof, of the arguments presented. Memories for Leo weren't vague recollections. They were vivid, high-definition replays, every detail perfectly preserved, every scent, every sound, every precisely calibrated light particle. He remembered the exact shade of blue on the flight attendant's uniform from the last time he flew, 3 years ago, and could compare it with the current one, noting the slight deviation in hue, a detail no one else would ever notice or care about. He perceived the world not as a fluid, amorphous entity, but as a vast interconnected machine, every part working in precise, measurable ways. The hum of the aircraft wasn't just noise, it was a complex symphony of frequencies, each one telling a story about the engines, the air conditioning, the subtle vibrations of the fuselage. He could feel the slight tilt of the plane as it taxied, a fraction of a degree imperceptible to others, but clear as day to his finely tuned proprioception. This acute sensitivity meant that ordinary sounds, smells, or textures could be overwhelming, a bombardment of information that most brains filtered out automatically. For Leo, there was no filter, only raw input, an unfiltered deluge that he painstakingly tried to organize into understandable patterns, a continuous, demanding intellectual exercise that left him drained, yet infinitely curious. His emotional intelligence, though expressed differently, ran deeper than many realized. He didn't always know how to articulate feelings with words, but he understood the subtle shifts in body language, the micro-expressions that flashed across faces, the unspoken anxieties that rippled through a crowd. He felt the collective tension in the cabin, the nervous energy of pre-flight jitters, like a subtle tremor beneath his skin. He registered the impatience of the businessman, the quiet worry of the elderly woman clutching her rosary beads, the barely contained excitement of a child. He processed these not as abstract concepts, but as tangible data points, contributing to his internal model of the human condition. A model far more complex and nuanced than any textbook could describe, born from years of intense observation and quiet empathy. His unique logic often made him seem detached, but it was merely a different way of connecting. When faced with a problem, his mind immediately sought the most efficient, logical solution, bypassing the emotional detours that often clouded others' judgment. He saw the world as a series of interconnected systems, and problems as glitches to be fixed, puzzles to be solved. This often led to frustration when others couldn't grasp his direct, almost mathematical approach to human interactions or everyday challenges. He didn't understand why people complicated simple things, why emotions so often overshadowed practicality. For Leo, the clearest path was always the most direct one, a principle he applied equally to astrophysics and the arrangement of his cereal boxes, a logic both profound and profoundly isolating in a world that rarely operated on such precise terms. His inner world was a sanctuary, a vast library filled with diagrams, schematics, equations, and an almost encyclopedic knowledge of subjects ranging from quantum physics to the migratory patterns of monarch butterflies. He had taught himself advanced calculus by age 10, driven by an insatiable curiosity about how things worked, about the underlying principles governing the universe. This was where he felt truly free, truly himself, unburdened by the expectations and misunderstandings of the external world. In this private domain, his hyper-focus became a superpower, allowing him to dive deep into subjects with an intensity that would exhaust most others. He could spend hours, days, even weeks, unraveling a complex problem, driven by an innate desire for understanding, a silent pursuit of truth in a world that, ironically, rarely bothered to look for truth within him. The setting was a standard domestic flight, a cross-country journey from Denver to Chicago, the kind that thousands of Americans undertake every day. The cabin, with its rows of beige and blue seats, felt familiar, almost mundane, a liminal space where people briefly existed side by side without truly connecting. The fluorescent lights hummed a steady, almost soporific tune, reflecting off the polished plastic of the overhead panels. This was a public sphere, designed for efficiency and mass transit, not for individual recognition, least of all for someone like Leo, whose quiet nature easily allowed him to recede into the background. The air was thick with the faint recycled scent of disinfectant and human breath, a closed environment where every cough, every murmur, every subtle shift in posture was amplified, contributing to Leo's already heightened sensory awareness. It was a perfectly ordinary microcosm of American society, where the unusual was often overlooked or worse, misinterpreted. The flight crew, a seemingly interchangeable group of professionals, moved through the cabin with a practiced efficiency that bordered on autopilot. There was Captain Miller, a man whose voice over the intercom carried the weight of countless flight hours, yet whose brief, almost perfunctory interactions with passengers hinted at a detachment born of routine. Then there was Sarah, the lead flight attendant, with her bright, unwavering smile and eyes that scanned the cabin for potential issues, though her gaze often slid over Leo, registering him simply as that quiet kid. The co-pilot, a younger man named Ben, remained tucked away in the cockpit, a voice heard but never seen, his presence a constant, unseen force in the sky. These figures of authority, entrusted with the safety of hundreds, operated within established protocols, their training emphasizing uniformity and predictability, leaving little room for the unconventional. The passengers themselves formed a diverse, yet surprisingly homogeneous cross-section of society. Business travelers in crisp shirts hunched over laptops, their faces illuminated by the screen's cold glow. Families with restless children tried to manage their excitement or boredom. Elderly couples dozed peacefully, their heads resting against the headrests. Each person was engrossed in their own world, their own journey, their own anxieties and expectations. A collective of individuals largely uninterested in anything that deviated from the norm. Leo, with his stillness and his focused gaze, existed outside this general flow, an anomaly in a space designed for easy categorization. He was not a crying baby, not a boisterous group, not a demanding executive. He was simply Leo, and in their collective unconscious, he registered as little more than a seat number. The subtle biases, ingrained and often unconscious, manifested in quiet ways. When a child cried, a flight attendant would immediately go to comfort them. When a business traveler had a question, they would receive a prompt, attentive answer. But for Leo, there was a polite distance, a slight hesitancy in their approach, as if they were unsure how to interact with his quiet intensity. Their smiles, though professional, never quite reached their eyes when they looked his way, a subtle barrier of unfamiliarity. They assumed his silence meant he didn't need anything, or perhaps couldn't articulate what he needed. This systemic oversight, a byproduct of well-intentioned but ill-informed assumptions about neurodiversity, was woven into the very fabric of the environment, a quiet exclusion that denied Leo even the basic courtesy of genuine connection, marking him as inherently different. This environment reinforced the invisible walls that often surrounded Leo. He was a passenger, granted, but not an engaged participant. He was observed, but not truly seen. The authority figures, from the distant pilot to the passing flight attendants, inadvertently contributed to this sense of isolation, their interactions framed by a lack of understanding or awareness. They operated under the assumption that all passengers would behave in predictable ways, or at least communicate their needs in a typical fashion. Leo's quiet self-containment, a coping mechanism for his sensory sensitivities, and a manifestation of his deep internal focus, was misread as aloofness or a lack of comprehension. This was not overt cruelty, but the more insidious prejudice of ignorance, a silent neglect born from a system unprepared to recognize or nurture genius that didn't fit neatly into their predefined categories. Even the general chatter of the cabin, the snippets of conversation, the laughter, the murmurs of shared excitement or complaint, created an auditory backdrop that further emphasized Leo's quiet isolation. He heard it all, processed it all, but was not part of it. The subtle social cues, the easy give and take of casual interaction, were a foreign language he was still diligently trying to decipher, a complex algorithm that eluded a simple, logical solution. In this confined space, surrounded by hundreds of people, Leo was in essence alone, a silent island in a sea of humanity. The aircraft, designed to bring people closer, paradoxically served to highlight the distance between his unique perception of the world and the conventional realities of those around him, a poignant testament to the challenge of being a silent genius in a loud, often oblivious world. From his quiet vantage point, Leo began to notice anomalies that no one else seemed to register. As the plane taxied towards the runway, he felt a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor, a rhythmic pulsation that was slightly off, a discordant note in the engine's usual hum. His sensitive hearing, often a source of discomfort, picked up a faint metallic groan from the undercarriage, a sound too deep and resonant to be merely the landing gear retracting. He catalogued these sensations, comparing them against the vast repository of aviation data stored in his mind. To any other passenger, it was just the normal sounds of an aircraft preparing for takeoff, but for Leo, these were data points, signals in a complex system, suggesting a deviation from optimal performance. His brow furrowed almost imperceptibly, a silent question forming in his extraordinary mind. Later, as the plane ascended through the cloud cover, a gentle turbulence caused the cabin to sway. Passengers murmured nervously, and the flight attendants reassured them with practiced ease. But Leo noticed something more specific. The automatic stabilization system seemed to overcorrect, a slight, jerky movement that felt uncharacteristic. He observed the subtle fluctuations of the wing outside his window, the way it flexed with an almost imperceptible irregularity. His gaze was not casual. It was analytical, a silent diagnostic running in real time. He mentally reviewed the schematics of the aircraft's wing design, the hydraulic systems, the ailerons, seeking to understand the root cause of this minor deviation. This wasn't anxiety, it was pure, unadulterated intellectual curiosity, a deep need to understand the precise mechanics of every observed phenomenon. During the meal service, while other passengers unwrapped their plastic-covered trays, Leo continued his silent vigil. He noticed a fleeting expression of concern on the face of one of the flight attendants as she passed his row, a look that quickly vanished, replaced by her usual professional smile. It was the briefest of moments, easily missed, but Leo's keen observational skills had captured it, processing it as a potential indicator of underlying stress or an unspoken problem. He also registered the slight, almost imperceptible scent of burning oil, so faint it could have been dismissed as an anomaly from the galley. But for Leo, sensory details, no matter how minute, were rarely coincidental. They were clues, pieces of a larger puzzle, awaiting assembly and interpretation by his brilliant systematic mind. He knew, with a certainty that transcended mere intuition, that the plane's engines were not performing optimally. He could hear it in the subtle shift of their pitch, feel it in the altered rhythm of the vibrations through the floor. His internal clock, his uncanny ability to track and predict patterns, told him that the usual steady drone of the engines had a nascent waver, a barely discernible unevenness. He had once spent weeks poring over jet engine schematics, understanding the precise tolerances and operational parameters. Now his mind compared the live sensory input to those perfect specifications, detecting the minute discrepancies that hinted at a developing issue. This wasn't guesswork. It was a complex subconscious computation, a silent alarm bell ringing only in the highly tuned chambers of his own brain. These subtle signs, however, were completely overlooked by everyone else on board. The flight crew, trained to spot overt problems, didn't notice the minute fluctuations that Leo perceived. The passengers, engrossed in movies, books, or conversations, were oblivious to the faint smells or unusual vibrations. When Leo briefly turned from the window to glance at the cabin, his eyes held a knowing intensity, a silent question that no one was equipped to answer. His unique way of processing the world, his ability to detect minute deviations from norms, was a superpower. Yet in this context, it was a burden, a solitary knowledge that set him further apart, making him a Cassandra of the skies, seeing what others could not, but lacking the means to convey his urgent insights. His attempts, if one could even call them that, to signal his awareness were entirely non-verbal, easily dismissed by adults who didn't understand his communication style. A slight stiffening of his posture, a more intense focus on the wing, a barely perceptible turning of his head towards the cockpit. These were his silent pronouncements of concern. But to the flight attendant passing by, he was simply that quiet kid, still staring out the window. His brilliance remained cloaked by his neurodivergence, his profound understanding, trapped behind a barrier of social expectation and an inability to translate his internal knowledge into conventional, acceptable forms of communication. The subtle hum of impending trouble grew, perceived by the genius in seat 14A, yet utterly ignored by the very people who held hundreds of lives in their hands. The internal dissonance for Leo grew with every minute the flight continued. The faint, irregular hum from the engines, now a constant low thrum, was like an insistent fingernail scratching on a chalkboard, a sound only he could fully perceive. His mind, usually a realm of ordered logic, began to experience a rare form of agitation. He knew with an undeniable certainty that something was fundamentally wrong, but the sheer impossibility of communicating this knowledge, of bridging the vast chasm between his internal understanding and the external world's dismissive indifference, was a torment. He clasped his hands tightly in his lap, his knuckles white, a silent struggle against the rising tide of internal alarm, the unspoken words forming a painful knot in his throat. He had tried in his own way to signal his concern earlier. A focused gaze towards the flight attendant, a slight tilt of his head, as if listening intently to a sound only he could hear, a small, almost imperceptible gesture towards the emergency exit card, as if silently checking its details. But these subtle cues, so clear and logical within his own internal framework, were utterly lost on the busy crew, who saw only a quiet, perhaps slightly anxious teenager. Their reassuring smiles, meant to calm, only served to amplify his frustration, reinforcing the invisible barrier between his urgent knowledge and their placid unawareness. He was screaming on the inside, a silent, desperate plea for someone, anyone, to just listen. The weight of being misunderstood, a familiar burden for Leo, intensified within the confined space of the aircraft. He had learned over years to retreat, to build internal fortresses of knowledge and routine, to cope with a world that rarely met him on his own terms. Now, however, this learned coping mechanism became a profound source of isolation. His usual comfort in his own thoughts turned into a solitary prison, holding him captive with crucial information that could, he instinctively knew, have dire consequences. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. His genius, which should be a gift, was instead a silent curse, rendering him an unseen prophet in a world barreling towards unforeseen danger. He started a small, almost imperceptible ritual, a way to anchor himself against the rising tide of anxiety. He gently pressed his thumb against the tip of his index finger, then his middle finger, then his ring finger, and finally his pinky, a methodical, repetitive motion that brought a momentary sense of control amidst the growing internal chaos. He repeated the sequence, eyes still fixed on the window, his mind racing through possible scenarios, calculating probabilities, assessing risks. This quiet routine, a hidden solace, was his way of managing the overwhelming sensory input and the even more overwhelming emotional burden of his unrecognized prescience. It was a lifeline in a sea of ignorance, his only way to maintain composure. The airplane itself, usually a source of fascination and intricate understanding, now felt like a giant metal cage, its familiar sounds becoming sinister. The gentle hum of the air conditioning, the distant drone of the engines, the muffled voices of other passengers, all coalesced into a suffocating blanket of noise that amplified his distress. He longed for the quiet solitude of his room, where he could explore complex equations or meticulously assemble intricate models, a world where his mind was celebrated, not overlooked. Here, suspended thousands of feet in the air, his unique perception of reality was a burden, a solitary truth he could not share. His extraordinary mind a silent scream in a deafeningly ignorant world. As the minutes stretched, the tension within Leo became almost unbearable. He could feel the growing instability in the aircraft, a subtle tremor that hinted at a deeper mechanical strain, a sensation that no one else seemed to notice. The vibrant tapestry of his inner world, usually a source of immense comfort, now felt like a tangled mess of alarming data points, all converging on a single ominous conclusion. He squeezed his eyes shut for a brief moment, a desperate attempt to reset, to regain control, but the facts, the sounds, the vibrations persisted. He was trapped, not by physical restraints, but by the societal inability to see beyond his quiet demeanor, by the profound and dangerous consequence of overlooking a silent genius. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clang echoed through the cabin, followed by a dramatic lurch that sent a ripple of gasps through the passengers. The subtle hum Leo had detected morphed into a harsh, grinding screech, and the plane shuddered violently, dipping sharply to one side. Overhead lockers sprang open with alarming thuds, spilling a cascade of coats and small bags into the aisle. A few screams pierced the sudden, terrifying silence that had fallen over the cabin, swiftly replaced by a crescendo of murmurs and terrified whispers. The calm facade of routine was shattered, replaced by raw primal fear, and in the midst of it Leo remained frozen, not in terror, but in a heightened state of analytical awareness, every part of his being registering the catastrophic shift. The flight attendant, Sarah, her face now pale and stripped of its professional smile, stumbled down the aisle, her voice tight with barely contained panic as she fumbled for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she managed, her voice cracking, "please remain calm. We are experiencing some turbulence." Her words, meant to soothe, only amplified the underlying terror, especially as another violent jolt sent a ripple of passengers crying out in distress. The rumbling grew louder, a deep, ominous roar that seemed to emanate from the very core of the aircraft. Leo's hypersensitive hearing processed the difference instantly. This was not turbulence. This was a critical mechanical failure, a sound he had only ever heard in simulations, now horribly real. Then, the unthinkable happened. The pilot's voice, which had been a symbol of calm authority, crackled over the intercom. But this time it was distorted, strained, a desperate gasp rather than a composed announcement. Mayday, Mayday. We've lost Engine 2. Control surfaces. Unresponsive. The transmission broke off abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence, then a burst of static. A collective, terrified wail erupted from the passengers. Children began to cry hysterically. Parents clutched them close, their faces etched with despair. Leo's head snapped up, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with a sudden, urgent clarity. This was the moment. The situation had escalated from anomaly to catastrophe, demanding immediate, precise intervention. From the front of the cabin, the remaining flight attendants, their faces etched with shock, began frantically trying to organize passengers, their movements clumsy with fear. "Brace for impact," one cried out, her voice barely audible over the rising roar of the wind outside. A man several rows ahead, his face contorted with panic, began shouting hysterically, demanding to know what was happening, pounding on the back of the seat in front of him. The air was thick with the scent of fear, metallic and acrid, and the sound of muffled prayers and sobs filled the space. The plane continued its terrifying descent, a metallic coffin plummeting through the sky, and Leo, in seat 14A, was suddenly, acutely aware that hundreds of lives now depended on something beyond the crew's overwhelmed capabilities. Sarah, her eyes darting wildly, caught sight of Leo. She had dismissed him earlier, seen him as just another quiet, perhaps difficult passenger. Now, in the raw, terrifying glare of impending disaster, she saw only a potential obstacle. "Sir, please remain in your seat," she barked, her voice strained, misinterpreting his sudden, intense focus as defiance or an attempt to move. She reached out, almost instinctively, to push him back, to keep him in place, to maintain some semblance of order in a world rapidly devolving into chaos. It was a reflex born of desperation, a complete failure to recognize the genius simmering beneath his calm exterior, a tragic example of how prejudice can blind even in the face of imminent danger. Just as she was about to touch him, Leo, without a word, pushed past her, his movements surprisingly swift and decisive. His eyes were no longer lost in thought, they were sharply focused, scanning the cabin, then the emergency exits, then, crucially, the cockpit door. His face, usually placid, now held an expression of intense, almost fierce determination. He had processed the pilot's garbled message, recognized the dire implications of control surfaces unresponsive, and his mind, operating at warp speed, had already begun to construct a solution. He moved with a purpose, a quiet force of nature, utterly unconcerned with the chaos erupting around him, or the bewildered, terrified looks now directed his way by passengers who suddenly saw him not as an anomaly, but as an inexplicable, determined enigma. Leo burst into the cockpit, pushing past the disoriented flight attendant who had been attempting to rouse the unconscious pilot, slumped forward over the controls. The co-pilot Ben was slumped against the side console, eyes wide with terror, frantically trying to re-engage unresponsive switches, his face slick with sweat. The cockpit was a chaotic symphony of blaring alarms, flashing red lights, and the violent shuddering of the plane which continued its terrifying descent. Ben looked up, startled, his eyes momentarily meeting Leo's, seeing not a terrified kid, but an almost unnerving calm, a focused intensity that defied the imminent disaster. Who are you?" Ben stammered, his voice hoarse with fear. But Leo didn't answer, his gaze already sweeping across the instrument panel with an astonishing speed and precision. Without a word, Leo's hands moved with a fluidity that was almost balletic, reaching for specific switches, his fingers flying across the complex array of buttons and dials. "Engine 2 fire suppression," he murmured, barely audible over the alarms, his voice steady. "Hydraulic pressure loss, primary system, switching to auxiliary pump." Ben watched, stunned, as Leo's fingers, almost independently, seemed to know exactly where to go, bypassing the panicked fumbling Ben himself had been engaged in moments before. Leo's eyes darted between the airspeed indicator and the altimeter, his brain processing the vectors of their fall, calculating their trajectory with an almost superhuman speed. The cockpit, once a symbol of chaos, suddenly had a quiet, methodical precision to Leo's movements, a stark contrast to the surrounding panic. "Flaps 10 degrees, carefully," Leo instructed, his voice gaining in confidence, his eyes still glued to the instruments. "Counteract the yaw. Adjust trim for left-wing drag." Ben, still grappling with disbelief, found himself instinctively responding, his hands mirroring Leo's precise commands, pulling levers, turning dials. He didn't understand how this kid knew any of this, but the sheer confidence and accuracy of Leo's instructions were undeniable. It was as if Leo was speaking a language only the plane understood, translating its desperate signals into actionable commands. The shuddering lessened almost imperceptibly, a brief flicker of hope in the terrifying plummet, and the shrill scream of the wind outside seemed to lessen for a fraction of a second. Leo continued, his voice a calm anchor in the storm, guiding Ben through a series of complex maneuvers that defied standard emergency protocols, but somehow made perfect logical sense. "Pitch up slightly, gain minimal speed for control authority. We need to stabilize the roll." He identified specific circuit breakers, explaining their function and the precise sequence for resetting them, details that only a deeply experienced aviation engineer would know. It wasn't guesswork. It was a profound, intuitive understanding of the aircraft's entire system, a mental blueprint that Leo had constructed and perfected over years of solitary study. His hands, though slender, moved with the certainty of a master craftsman, coaxing the dying plane back from the brink of oblivion. The alarms, one by one, began to silence, replaced by the persistent but less frantic hum of the remaining engine. The terrifying red lights flickered off, leaving only the steady glow of the normal instrument panel. Leo, still focused, still guiding Ben, remained utterly composed, his face still devoid of overt emotion, but his eyes gleaming with an intense, almost joyful concentration. He was in his element, a silent maestro conducting a symphony of mechanics, his brilliant mind orchestrating a complex dance between human intervention and the failing machinery. The immense pressure seemed to fuel his focus, sharpening his already extraordinary abilities, making him an unstoppable force of quiet genius. Slowly, painstakingly, the plane began to respond. The violent lurches subsided, replaced by a still rough but controllable descent. The chaotic shuddering softened to a strong vibration, and the chilling sensation of freefall eased. Leo had not just reacted. He had anticipated, calculated, and executed a series of maneuvers that were saving their lives. He had transformed from the quiet, overlooked boy in seat 14A to the undeniable, silent conductor of their fate, his true genius now undeniably on display, not in a classroom or a lab, but in the most high-stakes, life-or-death situation imaginable, forcing the world to finally see the extraordinary mind they had so casually dismissed. A stunned silence descended upon the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the remaining engine and the gentle thud of the plane, as Leo expertly guided Ben through the final critical adjustments. Ben, the co-pilot, stared at Leo, his mouth slightly agape, disbelief warring with profound relief on his sweat-streaked face. The terror that had gripped him moments before was replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe, an almost reverent quiet. He looked at the instrument panel, then back at Leo, searching for an explanation, for a logical reason why this quiet teenager knew more about flying a crippled jet than he, a trained pilot, did. His previous dismissal of Leo, the unconscious assumptions about his quietness, now crashed down on him with the full weight of shame and profound admiration. Through the open cockpit door, the flight attendants, who had braced for impact, slowly straightened, their eyes wide and disbelieving. Sarah, who had just tried to physically restrain Leo, felt a hot flush of embarrassment spread across her cheeks. She had seen only a child who wasn't following instructions. Now, she was witnessing a miracle orchestrated by that very same child. The collective fear in the cabin began to recede, replaced by a ripple of murmurs, then hushed whispers. Passengers peered forward, trying to understand what had just happened, their eyes drawn to the figure in the cockpit, a silent, almost ethereal presence guiding their survival. The air was thick with the residue of terror, but also with a nascent, overwhelming sense of wonder. The subtle social cues shifted dramatically. No longer were glances dismissive or pitying. They were filled with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and a growing, undeniable respect. People who had pointedly avoided eye contact with Leo earlier now found their gazes drawn to him, trying to reconcile the quiet, seemingly detached boy with the focused, brilliant individual who had just saved their lives. A businessman who had scoffed at Leo's presence just hours before now swallowed hard, his face pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by a profound sense of humility. The perception of Leo was undergoing a radical, irreversible transformation, shattering preconceived notions of what brilliance looked like. A few passengers, still trembling, began to cry softly, but these were now tears of relief, not despair. An elderly woman who had been praying fervently slowly lowered her hands, a look of profound gratitude washing over her face as she gazed towards the front of the plane. The silent judgment that had cloaked Leo for so long was dissolving, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of his extraordinary capabilities. This was not just a rescue, it was a revelation, a public unveiling of a genius that had been hidden in plain sight, dismissed by a world too quick to judge and too slow to truly see. The captain, now slowly regaining consciousness, stirred and looked around, his eyes widening in confusion as he took in Leo's presence at the controls, guided by Ben. His initial reaction was bewilderment, then a dawning realization, as he processed the stable descent and the quiet hum of the engine. He looked at Ben, who offered a small, disbelieving shake of his head, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible feat they had just witnessed. The hierarchy of command, the established order, had been turned on its head, with a neurodivergent teenager stepping into the breach and performing beyond all expectation. The profound change in atmosphere was almost palpable. The tension had given way to an almost sacred stillness, a collective processing of the unfathomable. Every passenger, every crew member was now locked into the unfolding miracle, their previous indifference to Leo replaced by an intense, almost desperate attention. They watched his every move, listened to his every quiet instruction, suddenly desperate to understand the inner workings of this silent hero. The world had been forced quite literally to look up and see the quiet genius they had so carelessly overlooked, acknowledging his immense value in the most dramatic way possible. As the aircraft, now stabilized, continued its descent towards the emergency landing strip, Ben, still under Leo's precise guidance, offered a gesture that symbolized a seismic shift. "Leo," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, I don't know how you did that, but thank you. Thank you." He extended a hand, trembling slightly, offering it to Leo not as a pilot to a passenger, but as one professional to another, a genuine acknowledgement of expertise and courage. It was a simple yet profound act of respect, shattering the invisible barrier of authority and assumption that had previously defined their interaction. Leo, after a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, met his gaze and nodded, a silent acceptance of the newfound camaraderie. Sarah, the lead flight attendant, her face still pale but now radiating profound relief, approached the cockpit door. She didn't speak, her voice lost in the emotion that choked her throat. Instead, she offered a small, hesitant bow, a gesture of profound respect that transcended words. It was an unspoken apology, a silent recognition of her earlier misjudgment, and a deep, heartfelt gratitude for the lives Leo had saved. Her earlier brusqueness had vanished, replaced by a humility that spoke volumes, conveying a depth of feeling that no formal apology could ever match, a testament to the transformative power of witnessing true genius. From the cabin, an older woman, her face streaked with tears, slowly rose from her seat and, with a shaky voice, began to clap. Her solitary applause was quickly joined by others, a hesitant ripple at first, then a growing crescendo of clapping and murmurs of "thank you" and "hero." The sounds were not boisterous or celebratory, but deeply felt, a collective expression of awe and profound gratitude. Passengers who had previously ignored Leo now looked at him with admiration, some even offering small, tearful smiles. The disdain, the indifference, the subtle exclusion had evaporated, replaced by an outpouring of genuine human connection and reverence. Even the previously gruff businessman, who had complained about legroom, now looked at Leo with an expression of profound shock and reluctant respect. He didn't clap, but his rigid posture softened, and a muscle in his jaw twitched as he fought to compose himself. His eyes, though still wary, held a newfound curiosity, a silent question about the nature of this quiet, unassuming young man. His skepticism had been utterly dismantled by the undeniable reality of Leo's brilliance, forcing him to confront the limitations of his own preconceived notions and acknowledge a hero who defied all his expectations. The captain, now fully alert, his voice still weak but infused with a dawning awe, managed to utter, "Son, you saved us all." His eyes, trained to assess and command, now looked at Leo with a mixture of professional respect and deep personal wonder. He extended a hand, a powerful, calloused hand that had guided countless planes, and placed it gently on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of profound acknowledgement and a silent passing of the torch. It was a moment of true, unadulterated recognition, a testament to the breaking down of barriers between traditional authority and unconventional genius. As the plane touched down with a rough but successful landing, a wave of relief washed over the cabin. The applause swelled, becoming a roar, a spontaneous and heartfelt tribute. Leo, still composed, still quiet, simply nodded, his gaze briefly meeting the eyes of a young boy in the front row, who was staring at him with wide-eyed wonder. In that moment, a fundamental shift occurred. Leo was no longer just a passenger, no longer an overlooked anomaly. He was the silent hero, acknowledged and revered, his genius finally seen, breaking through the prejudice that had long obscured his true, extraordinary self. Hours later, after the chaos of emergency services, medical checks, and endless debriefings with bewildered aviation officials, Leo was finally home. The quiet, familiar hum of his own bedroom was a welcome balm after the overwhelming sensory assault of the last few hours. His mother, her face still tear-streaked but now beaming with a mixture of awe and profound relief, sat beside him on his bed, gently stroking his hair. She didn't press for details, knowing his need for quiet processing, but her presence was a warm, reassuring anchor in the whirlwind that had been his day. The world had shaken, but her love, a constant in his life, remained an unwavering comfort. "Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you did something incredible today. Do you know how many lives you saved?" Leo, his gaze fixed on the meticulous model airplane suspended from his ceiling, nodded almost imperceptibly. He didn't need the validation in words. The complex calculations in his mind, the successful execution of his plan, were validation enough. But his mother's presence, her quiet understanding, allowed a subtle softening in his rigid posture, a rare moment of vulnerability in his otherwise tightly controlled world. He felt the quiet pride emanating from her, a warmth that permeated his carefully constructed defenses. He turned his head slightly, his eyes, usually so intent on external details, now held a deep, reflective quality. The auxiliary hydraulic pump. "It was designed for a 12% override capacity," he murmured, his voice soft almost to himself, as if still processing the technicalities. His mother smiled gently, understanding that this was his way of expressing the enormity of what had occurred, his way of processing the emotional through the logical. She knew that for Leo, the success lay in the precise execution of the solution, the elegance of the engineering, and the confirmation of his own profound knowledge, rather than the abstract concept of heroism. She reached out, gently taking his hand, her fingers tracing the faint lines of his palm. "You always amaze me, Leo," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "You see things no one else does. You understand things in a way that's extraordinary." There was no judgment in her tone, only unconditional acceptance and a deep, abiding love. This quiet, intimate conversation was the true homecoming, a return to the one place where his differences were not just tolerated, but celebrated, where his unique way of perceiving the world was seen as a gift, not a burden. It was a safe harbor after the storm, allowing him to quietly process the immense event. Leo looked at her, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his lips. In his mind, he replayed the complex series of actions he had taken in the cockpit, the precise calculations, the intricate maneuvers. The fear he had felt was not for himself, but for the system, for the failure of the mechanism, for the breakdown of order. Saving the lives had been a logical outcome of fixing the problem, a natural consequence of applying his knowledge. His genius was not a conscious act of heroism, but an innate drive to solve, to understand, to correct imbalances, a silent compulsion that had today yielded a miraculous result. In the quiet of his room, with the familiar comfort of his mother's presence, Leo allowed himself a rare moment of deep, internal satisfaction. He was still Leo, still saw the world in patterns and numbers, still navigated social interactions with difficulty. But something fundamental had shifted. He had been seen, truly seen, not as an autistic kid, but as a brilliant, life-saving mind. The experience, though terrifying, had affirmed his deepest conviction, that his unique way of thinking held immense value, that his silent genius was not just a personal gift, but a powerful force that could, when truly unleashed, change the world. The reverberations of Leo's heroic act rippled far beyond the confines of the airplane. At the school he attended, conversations among staff shifted. Teachers who had once viewed him through a lens of academic struggles and social difficulties now spoke of his unbelievable intellect and astonishing abilities. The principal, a stern woman who had often signed off on notes regarding Leo's behavioral challenges, now initiated meetings about creating more inclusive learning environments, specifically mentioning the need to identify and nurture hidden talents in all students, especially those who communicated differently. It was a profound, overdue acknowledgement that their systems had failed to recognize the brilliance right under their noses, a silent revolution taking place within the sterile school hallways. New opportunities began to emerge, not just for Leo, but for other neurodivergent students within the community. A local aviation museum reached out, offering Leo an honorary internship, inviting him to consult on exhibit designs and mechanical operations. The story of the quiet kid who saved the plane spread, inspiring parents of children with autism to share their own stories of hidden talents and overlooked potential. There was a palpable shift in the air, a newfound willingness to look beyond conventional measures of intelligence and to embrace the diverse spectrum of human abilities. The tragic incident had become a catalyst for empathy, opening doors that had long been stubbornly shut. Conversations among airline staff took on a new tone. Training protocols were reviewed, emphasizing the importance of active listening and nonverbal communication, especially when interacting with passengers who might present differently. The co-pilot, Ben, became a vocal advocate for neurodiversity awareness, recounting Leo's story with a fervent passion that moved audiences. He spoke of the danger of underestimation, of the silent biases that could cost lives, urging his colleagues to see every individual as a potential resource, a wellspring of untapped knowledge. The professional world, often rigid and resistant to change, was forced to confront its own blind spots and evolve. The local community, initially focused on the drama of the plane crash, began to engage with the deeper narrative of Leo's unrecognized genius. A grassroots movement started, advocating for better support systems for neurodivergent individuals, pushing for programs that would foster their unique skills rather than trying to fit them into conventional molds. Fundraisers were organized, awareness campaigns launched, all inspired by the quiet teenager who had redefined heroism. The story had touched a nerve, prompting people to reflect on their own biases and to consider how many other brilliant minds might be languishing, unseen and unheard, in their very midst. Adults who had previously treated Leo with a mixture of polite dismissal and awkward uncertainty now approached him with genuine respect, their expressions a blend of awe and curiosity. They no longer spoke down to him or simplified their language. Instead, they engaged him with thoughtful questions, seeking to understand his process, his insights. It was a subtle but profound shift in social dynamics, a dismantling of the patronizing attitudes that often accompany a lack of understanding. The silent revolution sparked by Leo was changing not just policies, but also hearts and minds, one respectful interaction at a time. This transformation was realistic, not a sudden utopian ideal. There were still those who struggled to understand, still moments of awkwardness or misunderstanding. But the initial, pervasive indifference had been replaced by a genuine openness, a willingness to learn and adapt. The seeds of inclusion had been sown, nurtured by the undeniable power of Leo's actions. The community was slowly but surely beginning to adapt, to bend, to acknowledge that intelligence and capability came in many forms, often in the quietest, most unexpected packages. Leo's silent triumph was paving the way for a more empathetic and understanding world. Weeks later, Leo stood on the observation deck of the local airport, the wind whipping gently around him. He watched a plane soar into the sky, its powerful engines leaving a trail of white vapor against the endless blue. His face, serene and thoughtful, reflected the vastness above. He was still the same Leo, quiet and observant, still lost in the intricate patterns of the world, still processing reality in his unique, profound way. The accolades and the media attention had mostly faded, retreating back to the periphery of his life, but the internal shift, the public acknowledgement of his brilliance, remained a quiet, enduring truth. He carried the experience within him, a silent understanding of his own capabilities. He felt the familiar hum of the engines, the subtle vibrations through the concrete beneath his feet, but now there was a different resonance to them. It was no longer a sound of isolation or impending disaster, but a symphony of possibility, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and to his own undeniable place within that intricate dance. The world hadn't entirely changed overnight. Prejudice and misunderstanding still existed, and many would still struggle to fully grasp his unique way of being. But one door, a significant one, had undeniably opened. One barrier had been broken, proving that genius could manifest in the most unexpected forms, from the quietest corners. A young boy, no older than 7, clutching a toy airplane, approached Leo hesitantly. Are you the hero?" he asked, his voice full of a child's unvarnished wonder. Leo looked down at him, his moss-colored eyes meeting the boy's gaze for a rare, sustained moment. He didn't speak, but offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and a deep, quiet understanding. The boy's eyes lit up, seeing not just a hero but a reflection of his own budding curiosity, a quiet assurance that being different could also mean being extraordinary, that his own unique world held untapped power. Leo turned his gaze back to the sky, watching the diminishing speck of the departing aircraft. The struggle would continue. The world was still learning, still adapting, but the seed of transformation had been planted. He was no longer just the autistic kid in seat 14A. He was Leo, the silent hero, whose extraordinary mind had saved lives and, in doing so, had quietly ignited a flame of understanding and acceptance. His triumph was not loud or dramatic, but a deeply resonant testament to the power of overlooked brilliance, a quiet revolution that had started thousands of feet in the air and was now gently, profoundly settling on the ground. The image of him standing there, a solitary figure against the vast sky, conveyed a powerful message. His dignity was intact, his unique identity affirmed. He didn't need fanfare or constant recognition. His worth was intrinsic, woven into the very fabric of his being. The world had been forced to witness his true value, and that witness, even for a moment, had fundamentally altered the landscape. He had shown them that empathy was not just about pity, but about seeking to understand, and that true strength often resided in the quietest, most unexpected places, challenging every preconceived notion. The script closed on a final, contemplative image. Leo tracing the outline of a bird soaring freely in the vast expanse of the sky, his subtle smile hinting at a newfound sense of quiet empowerment. He was still different, still navigated the world on his own terms, But now he did so with the knowledge that his unique gifts had not only been seen, but had profoundly impacted the lives of others. It was a dignified closure, honoring his complexity and depth, leaving the audience with a lasting sense of hope and the powerful realization that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who speak the least. Their genius communicated not in words, but in deeds that defy all expectation.